Hello, everybody. My name is Teo Yu Yen, and I'm one of the editors of Academia SG. Welcome to Academia SG's Singapore Studies Junior Scholar Seminar Series. We're very glad to have you join us today for a presentation by Timothy Loh. Before we begin, let me note that this seminar will feature live captioning by AI Media and simultaneous Singapore Sign Language interpretation by Equal Dreams. Azam or Clara will be spotlighted throughout the session. If you would like to view the interpretation, please use the speaker view function. You may click on speaker view on the top right-hand corner of your Zoom window. And to access live captioning, please click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may also use the URL posted in the chat box. To minimize distractions, we ask that all audience members keep your videos off and microphones muted during the session until we arrive at the Q&A segment when some of you may want to verbalize or sign your questions. If you have questions or need help with troubleshooting, please message Academia SG Corey Tan privately using the Zoom chat function. Okay, so today's seminar is titled Mother Tongue Orphan, Sign Language and Multiculturalism in Singapore. Our presenter is Timothy Loh, a PhD candidate in History, Anthropology, and Science, Technology and Society at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he is also Graduate Fellow in the Language and Technology Lab. Timothy will be speaking for 30 minutes. And following Timothy's presentation, Professor Umbi will offer some responses and comments. Professor Ng is my colleague at the Nanyang Technological University. She's an associate professor in linguistics and multilingual studies at NTU's School of Humanities. She works in the area of bilingualism and multilingualism with a focus on the impact of language contact on individuals identity and social categorization and communicative aspects of aging. The success of our Junior Scholar Seminar series hinges heavily on senior scholars' support. So we're very grateful that Prof. Ng has generously agreed to be a discussant today. After Timothy and Prof. Ng have spoken, we will open for questions from the audience. Over to you, Timothy.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here at my talk for the Singapore Studies Junior Scholar Seminar Series today. My name is Timothy Loh, and I am a Singaporean PhD candidate at MIT in the doctoral program in History, Anthropology, and Science, Technology, and Society. My thanks to the Academia SG team for having me, especially Corey Tan and Teo Yu Yen, and to the Equal Dreams team for their accessibility work. I also want to thank Professor Umbi for agreeing to be my discussant for this paper, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. This talk that I'm presenting today is a truncated version of an article I'm preparing for submission to a journal, so I appreciate your thinking alongside me. I'm zooming in at the moment from Amman, Jordan, where I'm currently conducting dissertation fieldwork on different kinds of assistive technologies for deaf Jordanians, which has been the focus of my doctoral research in the past couple of years. The project that I present today, Mother Tongue Orphan, Sign Language and Multiculturalism in Singapore, actually began when I was back in Singapore during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. At first glance, these two projects seem to have little to do with each other, which is what I thought at first too. But as time has gone by, I have seen them as undergirded by an overarching goal to de-exceptionalize disability, by which I mean to see disability as a natural part of human variation that everyone should have a stake in. After all, as scholars of disability have argued, not only are disabled people taken together the largest minority in the world, anyone can become disabled at any time, through accidents or illness, for example, unlike other kinds of social identities like gender and race that at least appear to be more immutable. The disability studies scholar Leonard Davis has even argued that disability is missing in the triad of race, gender, and class. So in the social sciences and humanities, we have reached this point where we expect that any kind of analysis has to take these things into consideration. And Davis argues that all scholarship should consider disability in this way as well. Relatedly, in the broader literatures I'm trying to speak to, I frequently come up against the sense that disability is too different or too niche to be relevant to the myriad of things that other scholars are looking at. That disability is only important to subject specialists, which I don't think is true. Asking for feedback or comments on my work, for example, sometimes garners the response, oh, I don't know anything about disability. And what I've seen through these encounters is less that disability is not relevant, but disability has been made irrelevant because it complicates scholarly analysis. So my own research is inspired by the work of disability scholars and anthropologists like Michelle Friedner and Rosemary Garland Thompson to think about what the peripheral can teach us about the center, which are in fact co-produced and cannot be easily separated from each other. So what I hope today you'll see in my talk as it unfolds is that language policy for deaf Singaporeans reveals not only how the state conceives of language for them as a group, but also what the role of language is for all Singaporeans. And now that I've given this setup, let me get into this paper proper. In typical anthropological fashion, I'm going to start with a story. What's more, I have one language. Making sure I did not miss the emphasis, Sharon signed again. Just one, English. So I cannot let it deteriorate because I don't have Chinese. This was in June 2020, and we were in the middle of an interview as part of the research I was doing on sign language varieties in Singapore. Sharon is a deaf Chinese Singaporean woman in her late 30s and a friend I've known since 2009 when I first got involved with the deaf community in Singapore. But this was probably the first time we were having a conversation on her views on sign language and the politics of deafness. In recent years, in line with broader transnational deaf movements across the world, many deaf Singaporeans have been championing the use and recognition of Singapore Sign Language, SGSL, as the native language of the deaf community in Singapore, eschewing the use of a signing style that hewed more closely to English grammar and syntax that has dominated the Singaporean signing community for many decades. Sharon, however, was not a big proponent of this movement. She continued, but if you have a strong foundation in English, then it doesn't matter. You can use SGSL. So Sharon's comments struck me for a number of reasons. Firstly, they must be understood in the context of recent developments in sign language politics in Singapore. The term sign language in Singapore glosses over a complicated local linguistic ecology that includes signing exact English, SEE, Singapore Sign Language, SGSL, and varieties of Pidgin Sign English, PSE, that fall somewhere in between the two. Furthermore, the boundaries between these language varieties are blurry and unclear. Indeed, SEE and SGSL might represent ideal types on a spectrum of signing varieties that range from styles that follow English grammar and structure more closely to styles that are more conceptual and gestural. And I will explain this more in the later part of my talk. However, the right way to sign, whether to sign in SEE or SGSL, remains a contentious issue in Singapore. Secondly, Sharon's comments reveal that these ideas about wrong and right signing cannot be divorced from the broader politics of language use in Singapore. For Sharon, an enduring concern about signing SGSL versus SEE was the fear that using SGSL, which has a grammar and syntax different from that of English, would cause her English to deteriorate. Maintaining her English was important because she did not have a mother tongue, Singapore's official designation for the three other official languages of Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil, to fall back on. According to the state's bilingual policy, which has been in place since 1966, all Singaporeans are required to learn English as well as a mother tongue based on their ethnicity. Mandarin for Chinese Singaporeans, Malay for Malay Singaporeans, and an Indian language for Indian Singaporeans. However, deaf Singaporeans, whatever their ethnicity, are exempt from learning a second language. Hence, Sharon's fear that without good English and SEE to access it, deaf Singaporeans would be at a further disadvantage compared to the hearing counterparts, who presumably can rely on their second language if they are not good at English. So while Sharon's comments are based on a number of assumptions, first, that SEE and English are basically the same language in different modalities. Second, that SGSL is not a language, or at least not a language that is on par with Mandarin, Malay, or Tamil. And third, that most hearing Singaporeans are equally good at English and at their mother tongue, among others. In this talk, I focus less on examining these assumptions than on deaf people's experiences of the mother tongues, which have received little attention even in the rich literature on language planning and policies in Singapore. Drawing upon qualitative semi-structured interviews with 24 deaf and hearing signers in Singapore that I conducted in June 2020 and January 2021, as well as autoethnographic data as a hearing Singaporean involved in the Singaporean deaf community for the past 10 years, I argue that the conflation of ethnicity with language in Singapore's language policy renders sign language in Singapore ideologically suspect, a mother tongue orphan, since it cannot be linked to any one ethnicity and thus sits uncomfortably in the state's language schema. In a longer version of this research, I also argue, alongside other sign language researchers of Singapore like Phoebe Tay, that SGSL is stigmatized in a similar way to Singlish, which sees parallel ideological contestations, negatively as a form of broken English or positively as a marker of Singaporean identity. Ultimately, I argue that contestations over the status of sign language in Singapore must be understood in the context of the broader multilingual landscape and claims to multiculturalism in Singapore. I should also mention here that I am a hearing non-disabled scholar of deafness and sign languages, which shapes the questions I ask as well as the answers I find. So I try to be upfront and reflexive about how my positionality helps and hinders me in the field. For a number of mostly logistical reasons, I'm also opting to speak rather than to sign in this talk, which again makes this talk more or less accessible to different audiences. First, some clarifications. The term sign language in Singapore actually glosses over a complex contested linguistic ecology in the country and serves as a catch-all for a number of language forms. Sign language can refer to Singapore Sign Language, SGSL. Although of relatively recent coinage, it is said to be the native sign language of deaf Singaporeans and influenced by Shanghainese Sign Language, American Sign Language, Signing Exact English, and locally developed signs. SGSL purports to be a natural sign language, part of a category of manual visual languages that follow their own grammatical and syntactical structures, different from those of the spoken languages around them, and can be analyzed in terms of phonology, morphology, semantics, and so on in the same way that spoken languages can. But sign language can also refer to Signing Exact English, SEE or SEE2, a sign system, not actually a language, originating in the United States that was the official sign language in Singapore until the 2010s. SEE is a manually coded system that purportedly follows English grammar exactly, using its sentence structure and containing signs that correlate to its grammatical features. It should be noted here, though, that no one really follows SEE rules exactly because it is too cumbersome, and this was a point that was widely acknowledged and evident in the interviews that I conducted. For that reason, sign language can also refer to varieties of pidgin signed English, PSE, which result from contact between sign and spoken languages. Let me show you what this looks like. So this first video is an example of SEE signing. And this second video is an example of SGSL signing. So as you can see on this chart, SEE or PSE is much closer grammatically and syntactically to English than SGSL. So here, if you look at the left under SEE, the gloss says the best and most beauty with the suffix full, things with the thing with the suffix s or plural marker in the world can plus not be seen and to demonstrate past tense, or even touch to demonstrate past tense again. Right, and this translates to the best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. On the right side, that's the SGSL gloss. So the gloss there is I1, explain again, this SGSL now go. I, before, set up, Facebook group, theme, what? SGSL now mean what? Right, and this, it translates to, I want to explain again what the aim of SGSL now is. When I set up this Facebook group, its topic was what SGSL actually means, and this is my translation. So here, I mean, I hope that it's clear that these two things really look quite different from each other in terms of grammar and syntax. So indeed, the interviews I conducted in sign language using a signing style somewhere in between ASL and SGSL actually gave me a profound embodied sense of this debate. And I myself had to make decisions about what signs to use, how to order them in a sentence, how much mouthing to use, and so on while interacting and interviewing my interlocutors. The coexistence of these different language forms is a result of historical changes in deaf education and language policy in Singapore in the last few decades. For the sake of time, I won't go into those here, but feel free to ask about those in the Q&A. For the purposes of this talk, I just want to emphasize that the acceptance of SGSL in Singapore is far from universal, even among deaf Singaporeans. And today there remain contentions over what SGSL exactly refers to and how exactly deaf Singaporeans should be signing. In the rest of this talk, I situate these contentions in relation to broader language politics in Singapore and state concerns over multiculturalism. Much has already been written about Singapore's bilingual education policy, through which all Singaporeans are required to learn English as well as their mother tongue, which is assigned to them. Under the CMIO, Chinese, Malay, Indian, other classification system established under British colonialism, Chinese Singaporeans learn Mandarin Chinese, Malay Singaporeans learn Malay, and Indian Singaporeans learn Tamil, although they may also apply to learn a non-Tamil Indian language, namely Bengali, Gujarati, Hindi, Punjabi, or Urdu. Bilingual education is a long-standing part of state policy and must be understood as part of the government's efforts to manage multiculturalism in Singapore. As scholars like Lionel Wee and Lisa Lim have persuasively argued, the recognition of 4 official languages and the bilingual policy is meant to ensure parity among the races in Singapore, as well as to designate English as an inter-ethnic lingua franca among all Singaporeans. From its inception, quote, English was positioned as the language of the most economic value, as a bridge language between linguistic groups, and the mother tongue's position as the best vehicles for the importing of moral and traditional values, end quote. These language ideologies were instantiated in early state discourses about bilingual policy. For example, in then Minister of Education Tony Tan's parliamentary speech in 1986, in which he stated, children must learn English so that they will have a window to the knowledge, technology, and expertise of the world. They must know their mother tongues to enable them to know what makes us who we are. This is what Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores might call a racial-linguistic ideology, one in which language and race are co-naturalized. In Singapore, this ideology, conflating race and language, is one that was and continues to be promulgated explicitly through state policy and discourse. The bilingual policy has been around in some form at least since the People's Action Party, PAP, came to power in 1959, even before independence in 1965, when English, Malay, Mandarin, and Tamil were designated the 4 official languages of the nation under Article 153A of the Singapore Constitution, but has undergone many changes since its establishment. As far as my research has uncovered, however, one thing that has stayed constant is that deaf Singaporeans are exempt from the bilingual education policy, although deaf Singaporeans were educated in Chinese in the earliest provision of deaf education in Singapore. An overwhelming majority of my deaf interlocutors had never taken mother tongue classes before, although 1 or 2, placed in a mainstream setting, had taken mother tongue classes early on in primary school, but quickly dropped out. As Rachel, not her real name, related to me, she had taken Chinese in primary 1 and 2, but struggled with the 4 tones in Mandarin. When she failed the final examination, she felt frustrated and asked her mother to write to the Ministry of Education to exempt her from the mother tongue requirement. It is also worth noting here that it is not only deaf people who are exempt from the bilingual policy, although such cases are beyond the scope of this paper. Sociolinguists have made extensive critiques of the inadequacies of the bilingual policy and broader language planning and policy in Singapore. Here, I add another wrinkle to this dilemma by considering the experiences of deaf Singaporeans with official mother tongues. Herein lies the bind. If English is the language of instrumentality and access to science and technology in the West, and the mother tongues the locus of culture, values, and heritage, how are deaf Singaporeans who are exempt from the mother tongue requirement expected to know what makes them who they are? To play off Tony Tan's formulation. It is in this sense that I argue that sign language in Singapore is a mother tongue orphan, a language that is not tied to ethnicity. Indeed, it crosses ethnic categories and thus sits uncomfortably in the state's language schema, revealing the limits of the state's racial linguistic ideology. As I explicate in this final section, a number of my interviewees express a sense of alienation, both from the mother tongues, which they have little experience of, as well as from SGSL, which I argue stems at least partially from the language's uncomfortable positioning. The data also reveals, however, that many are starting to reclaim SGSL as their own and as the language of Singapore's deaf community. Many of the deaf Singaporeans I interviewed either could not relate to the term mother tongue or felt that it did not apply to them. Broadly, they showed a whole range of degrees of attachment to the mother tongues in Singapore and significantly expressed how the perspective on the mother tongues had shifted over time. Grace felt that not knowing Chinese meant that she could not access parts of Singaporean culture because there were things that her friends grew up with that she did not identify with, like popular media campaigns on television. She even bought some textbooks to self-learn Chinese and had her friends teach her some Chinese phrases. Larry, on the other hand, told me that he had never felt the need to learn Chinese and that he only felt like he needed it when interacting with older people who did not know English very well. In those cases, he would type on his phone to ask people around him to help communicate with these older people. Dennis found himself in a more ambivalent position. When he was younger, he did think to himself, I'm a Chinese person, so I need to learn Chinese. But many years later, no longer thought so, adding that many of his deaf friends also did not feel like they needed a second language and that English was enough for them. Fiona had a similar journey and had felt jealous of some of her hearing classmates learning a second language when she was growing up in a mainstream primary school, but ultimately decided that it was more important for her to have good English. The alienation that many deaf Singaporeans feel towards the mother tongues is, I argue, not only because they are exempt from the mother tongue requirement and never had to take classes in it growing up, but also because of the somewhat idiosyncratic way in which it is used in Singapore as the state's imposed designation for 3 specific languages, Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil, that are in fact not used by all Singaporeans at home. Ironically, in spite of the label mother tongue, any one Singaporean's mother tongue is actually based on paternal lineage, as one of my interlocutors, a hearing interpreter, pointed out. In an article in World Englishes, linguist Tan Ying Ying differentiates the mother tongue label as used by the Singaporean government from a mother tongue according to linguistic criteria, developing a framework that conceptualizes a mother tongue as, quote, one's language inheritance, language expertise, language function, and language identification, end quote. Based on these criteria, Tan argues that English can and should be thought of as a mother tongue for Singaporeans. So I find Tan's clarification helpful, but here I think it is worth unpacking the ideological suppositions of the term mother tongue as a kinship metaphor. Anthropologists have documented in multiple contexts the importance of kinship metaphors in discourses of the nation. In the Singaporean context, the choice of mother tongue as a label over a more neutral term like second language was a deliberate choice. Mother tongue calls to mind an unbroken chain of language passed down from generation to generation, obscuring the labor that was needed to naturalize this label in the form of the multiple language campaigns over the past decades, for example. The label also obscures the fact that given the broad diversity of immigrants from China, the Malay archipelago, and India to Singapore at the time of its founding, it's likely that Mandarin, Malay, or Tamil was only spoken by a small proportion of any mothers at that time. Mother tongue also establishes a semiotic link between language and the family, exemplified in Lee Kuan Yew's characterization of the essence of Chinese culture as, quote, the importance it places on the bond between parents and children, the ties among siblings, the ties between husband and wife, the authority of parents, and the duty of the young, end quote. There is certainly a degree of irony in situating the mother tongue in the family. As sociolinguists of Singapore have demonstrated, the language shift engendered by the bilingual policy and the Speak Mandarin campaign in particular actually disrupted communication within the family in the 1980s and 1990s, especially across generations. So I myself, having grown up only speaking English and Mandarin, was only ever able to engage in superficial conversation with my late paternal grandparents, who spoke primarily Teochew. In recent years, grassroots initiatives like LearnDialect.sg have emerged in Singapore in response to the desire of younger Singaporeans to learn Hokkien, Cantonese, and Teochew to communicate with the older generation. Many deaf interviewees related similar stories of being unable to communicate with their families, most often because their families did not sign, but even more so when their families were primarily Chinese speakers, any variety, such as Mandarin, but also Hokkien, Teochew, and so on, and could not depend on a shared linguistic repertoire like the English alphabet to communicate. So Dennis's parents, for instance, only knew basic sign language and spoke mostly Chinese, and so he relied on gestures to communicate with them. Dennis occasionally also had to rely on his younger brother and sister, who are both hearing, to facilitate communication with his parents. Unfortunately, neither of his siblings signed well, and so they would use primarily fingerspelling and writing. For important issues, Dennis would write back and forth with them in English, and they would then relate that message back to the parents in Chinese. So this meant that Dennis's communication with his parents required 2 degrees of translation, from sign language to English to Chinese, and then back again. But the orphaning of sign language also took place at a higher scale than the individual and the familial, with the adoption of SEE as the official language of the Singaporean deaf community in the late 1970s and 1980s that ideologically untethered sign language from its historical roots in Shanghainese Sign Language and to a certain degree American Sign Language. Furthermore, according to a number of my interlocutors, many of the younger deaf Singaporeans now find themselves unable to communicate with the generation of older deaf Singaporeans who are educated in Shanghainese Sign Language and use it as their primary mode of communication instead of SEE or SGSL. The recent recognition of the multiple streams that feed into SGSL, Shanghainese Sign Language, American Sign Language, Signing Exact English, and locally developed signs, should then be perhaps seen as a reclaiming of the historical lineage of sign language in Singapore, which is borne out in the interviews I conducted, in which many deaf Singaporeans expressed the hope that SGSL will be recognized as an official language in Singapore. This is not to say that these efforts to reclaim sign language in Singapore are uncontentious. As I alluded to earlier, the controversy over the right way to sign using SEE or SGSL also occurs somewhat in parallel with the debate over so-called Standard English and Singlish in Singapore, which has been ongoing at least since 1999, when the Speak Good English campaign, a campaign to promote the use of Standard English and to eliminate the use of Singlish, was first launched. Anxieties about the right way to sign, no doubt, are shaped by these broader anxieties about the right way to speak English. So language is never just about communication, but about identity, livelihood, and people's sense of belonging to multiple collectives. It is no wonder then that Lee Kuan Yew called Singapore's bilingual policy and its accompanying racial linguistic ideology his lifelong challenge. I've examined deaf Singaporeans' experiences with the mother tongues to think about what this might tell us about the stakes of multiculturalism in Singapore. Contestations over the right way to sign for deaf Singaporeans cannot be divorced from the broader politics of language planning and policy in Singapore. Sign language becomes a mother tongue orphan through its uneasy location in the state's language schema, revealing the limits of its racial linguistic ideology. As the mother tongues are loaded with moral and political weight through state discourse and policy, other languages in Singapore, including SGSL, are correspondingly devalued. Deaf Singaporeans' exemption from the mother tongue requirement does not mean they are not affected by it. On the contrary, I hope that this talk shows that it is that much more important to pay attention to the experiences of those who are not included in Singapore's bilingual education policy, which remains an indelible part of Singapore's sense of itself as a nation. If research from a racial linguistic perspective can shed light on the processes through which race and language might be co-naturalized, what I hope that this case from Singapore demonstrates is how this co-naturalization of race and language might take place even through those to whom the language policy is not meant to apply. By focusing on the nuanced relationships Singaporeans have with the mother tongues in Singapore, we can tell fuller and more complete Singapore stories. So I want to thank everyone who agreed to be interviewed for this project, which was partially funded by the NUS Development Grant. I'm grateful for that support, as well as that of Anthropology at Yale NUS College, my host department for the grant. This paper also received the honorable mention for the Society for East Asian Anthropology's 2021 Prize for Outstanding Graduate Student Paper, and I thank the selection committee for their kind comments on the paper. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Timothy, for that really interesting and insightful talk. I would now like to invite Professor Umbi Chin to give her comments. Bi, over to you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Yu Yan, and thank you for your introduction earlier. And I want to thank Timothy for taking us on a tour of the margins of Singapore, especially for those of us who are hearing. It really is a tour of the margins, because suddenly living in Singapore, deafness is not something that comes to mind every day, even though I think we should think about it a bit more. And Timothy's talk and his very compelling metaphor of mother tongue orphans certainly put this in the center. And I would like to also echo Timothy's point about the importance of examining the co-production of peripheral and prototypical members in society to better understand how we can, I guess, fix or improve our lives. So this idea that the peripheral can teach us about the center, I'm quoting Timothy here, cannot be more emphasized. Just because I only have 5 minutes, I have a couple of comments and questions that I perhaps should leave the questions to the audience, but I just can't resist. I would like to share with the audience and with Timothy. Perhaps let me start with a question. Timothy, I noticed that you talk about deafness as a disability. All right, I'm sure you know about the controversy surrounding this particular topic. And I guess later, I was wondering whether you want to address the audience about your own personal stance and why is deafness a disability for you and why some may actually disagree. Okay, now this sort of leads on to my next point, which is essentially a comment. Now, if we treat deafness as a disability, then the narrative of how people with disability are treated vis-a-vis the mother tongue policy is then consistent. All right, I just want to point out this whole issue of people with disability and then their exemption from mother tongue in Singapore. I think you alluded to that, but you didn't talk about it. But I think it's a very important one. This is not only in Singapore, but it's worldwide. So Singapore is by no means the only participant in this, what I think a problematic conceptualization of or association of disability and language. All right. Now, all over the world, every time there's some kind of language-related disability, and I think my students in the audience, if there are any here, knows that this is my pet hobby or horse, right? Every time there is a language-related disability, whether it's autism, specific language impairment, stuttering, anything, all right? This kind of disability are naturally seen as an impediment to successful bilingualism. So it is very common for teachers, healthcare professionals to advise parents against speaking more than one language to the child. So in the Singapore context, I guess if you have to pick one language, you are unlikely to pick a minority language or peripheral language. You are more likely to pick the language in the center. And we've actually done research to show that healthcare professionals, I'm talking about speech pathologists, doctors, all these people involved in the child's early life will make the decision to actually stop the parents from educating the child in the second language. I have a PhD student at the moment who is working with autism, and she found exactly the same thing. And if you think about it, this doesn't make sense, right? Because these people are already isolated, and cutting a language from them further isolates them from a major section of the community. All right. So we know the concerns come from a good place. So the idea that to really reduce the burden of the child who is growing up with disability. However, there is no evidence, and I cannot emphasize that more strongly, there is no evidence at all, that learning a second language or speaking another language is somehow a burden for these children. And this is interesting from the point of view that if it is a monolingual child that has this problem, or any language-related problem, I think Grosjean, a very famous linguist, said this: you never tell this child to stop talking. All right. However, if it's a child who is growing up in a bilingual context, the natural tendency is, don't speak a minority language. And I think this is a problem. And I think to address this problem, we need to address it at the source. And coming back to this point of this benign neglect of deaf Singaporeans, I am sort of not excusing the authorities, but I think generally to address this benign neglect, we need to address the philosophy behind this neglect. And very lastly, just one more comment. I don't want to overextend on my time, is I really like the comment on your very compelling and enigmatic metaphor of the mother tongue orphan. So by this, I assume you meant that deaf Singaporeans are orphans because they use sign language, and the sign language is not related to any ethnic group, right? And they don't have any ethnic group affiliation linguistically. That's deaf sign languages. If we accept, I think you alluded to that mother tongue is a misnomer in Singapore. Mother tongue, as we know, is a very monolingual concept. It has come from the idea that we only have one mother tongue. And if we look at Singapore, we know that this challenges all our earlier perception of what mother tongue is. 40 to 50% of Singaporeans grow up in bilingual families. And this is clearly established in the recent we suspected that all along, but it's confirmed in recent census. So for 50% of Singaporeans, they actually have two mother tongues, all right? And some of them, like you said, have English as a mother tongue. So if we accept that mother tongue is a misnomer, and we reject the racio-linguistic ideology that you talk about, right? Equating ethnicity with a language, and we reject this conflation. And then we accept that deafness is a culture. Deafness is a culture. They have their own language identifying with that culture. All right. If we move according to that assumption, then sign language is no longer a mother tongue orphan. Right? It has a legitimate home. So anyway, these are just my very brief comments, and I'll leave this with you, Timothy, and thank you so much for your really lovely talk.
Thank you very much, Bea, for those comments. I think it sets up or further broadens the context for, can people hear me? I just got a message about unmute myself. I am unmuted. Okay, yeah. Thank you, Bea. I think you set up or you widened the context for thinking about ability, disability, as well as bilingual education more generally. So that was really helpful. I wondered if, Tim, you would like to maybe address Professor Ng's comments very briefly. And then at the same time, I would invite the audience, if you have questions now, you may begin to type them into the chat box. If you would prefer to verbalize or sign your questions, please just put +1 in the chat box and I will call on you. But maybe now I'll hand it over to Timothy briefly and then we'll come back to those questions.
Yes, thank you so much. These questions are so rich that I can only address them briefly. Thank you so much for your comments. Those are super helpful. And I mean, I think that your expertise as an actual linguist, I think compared to, I think of myself as a linguistic anthropologist, kind of adjacent to that. But I think that your questions actually really reflect the richness of what that can add to our discussion. So I guess I would just quickly say something about deafness as disability or not disability. So in some way, so as Professor Ng kind of alluded to, there has been kind of a long-standing move in particular, parts of, in particular deaf communities to present deafness as a kind of ethnicity or as a kind of culture rather than disability. And so the argument is that deaf people are a linguistic minority more than anything else, right? And that they have a shared culture, shared histories, shared values, and so on. I think my approach is actually less to be, to basically say whether deafness is a disability or not, but more to think about the politics of what it means to call deafness a disability. By which I mean that I think that the question, it's maybe less a question that really has a yes/no answer, but more like what are the consequences of such labeling, right? And then here, I mean, the reason why I do approach this topic from kind of a disability studies standpoint is really because, at least at the level of policy, at the level of state arrangements, at the level of how people get accommodations, right? Deafness is certainly a disability in the sense that that is how deaf people are able to access the accommodations they need, right? So it's more, I think, that than whether or not I want to take a personal stance on whether deafness is a disability or not. The second thing is, as mentioned before, again, your comment about how this is similar for other kinds of language-related disabilities is honestly not something I've really thought about before, but that's very interesting, right? I think that at least from my ethnographic data, I think what's been interesting is to see that some of my interlocutors talk about how the denial, I guess, of deaf people to other languages other than the main language of that country is not necessarily universal, right? So for example, one of my interlocutors talked about how in Malaysia, maybe because there is less of a very robust sense of what language policy is, and deaf people can have access to Chinese and they have access to Malay and so on. And so, I mean, it's definitely interesting to think about how this scales up to different places around the world, as well as how it relates to other kinds of language-related disabilities. And honestly, more than anything else, that's something I think I have to spend a little bit more time thinking about. But thank you.
Great, thank you, Timothy. I see that Victor Chuang has a question. Victor, can I invite you to unmute yourself and turn on your video?
Thanks, Prof. Teo. And thank you, Timothy, for this wonderful talk. So my name is Victor. I just have two perhaps quick comments / questions, perhaps around methodology. The first is really, I'm just curious to hear about, I know that your PhD research is on the Middle East and Jordan, and I'm curious to hear about sort of how your research around deafness and cochlear implants and assistive technologies in the Middle East has influenced your frames about thinking around your approaches to this wonderful presentation you shared today about sign language in Singapore. So that's the first question. I think the second question perhaps is something that I'm thinking parallels what Professor Ng has asked as her last question. And what I'm thinking about is really, I'm quite struck with your initial comment about using the peripheral to think about the center. And I wonder if methodologically, what would this look like? What would your research and the questions that you might ask look like if you flip that frame around? Because I think within disability and deaf studies, a lot of the current thinking is about centering disability or deafness as a generative form of knowledge and embodiment. And I wonder if you ask different kinds of research and questions, if we center disability and deafness, especially if we think about SGSL and its claims as a valid language linked to perhaps an acceptance of deaf culture and identity in Singapore. So happy to hear what you think about those.
Thank you, Victor, for these questions. The first about the Middle East stuff, that's actually very interesting. I mean, again, as I kind of allude to at in the introduction, when I first started thinking about this concept of mother tongue orphan and sort of sign language in Singapore, it's something that had been kind of at the back of my head, but it hadn't been something I had actively researched, right? Because when I started my undergraduate studies, my doctoral studies, I had already left Singapore, right? I wasn't really thinking about those in academic terms necessarily. But then over time, when I began this project and was doing my research on Jordan and the Middle East at the same time, I really began to see some of these parallels, I think, or these become comparative cases that are very interesting for me, right? So one of the big things I think about is how language ideologies look different in these places, right? So the racial linguistic ideology, I think, is less apparent where I am. Right, so studying Jordan, you don't see the same kinds of claims that are made about what kinds of languages are appropriate for people, right? And that makes a difference, right? Because in Singapore there is an imperative on the state of the government to manage multiculturalism, right? Because there are substantial minorities, right? Whereas in Jordan, I mean, you see less of that. Certainly there are minorities. So like Armenians, for example, Circassians, Chechen people, right? But then the language of the state and the language of the people is still Arabic, right? So, I mean, I think that looks very, very different when you think about that kind of case versus trying to think about what the Singapore government is trying to do when it has to think about what language means for deaf people. Right, and then, for Arabic, it's also just like kind of a complicated situation because it's what is called diglossic, by which it means that there is a high level of the language that is used in very formal situations, education, politics, and so on. And then there are the dialects that are spoken in everyday life, and the dialects also differ from country to country. So Jordan looks different from Egypt, which looks different from Morocco, and so on. And then so like maybe a parallel way to think about that is that Mandarin is sometimes diglossic Chinese is sometimes diglossic in that there's Mandarin as a kind of like a formal language, and then like people have their own dialects like Hokkien and Teochew and so on. The difference is really that Mandarin is a mother tongue or is a first language for many people, whereas the high dialect of Arabic called Fusha is not. Right, and so it's been really interesting to think about how these kinds of very local contexts and local situations actually really shape, the kinds of policies that language planners and that state officials have to think about. And then so that's how I've been thinking about these two kind of things alongside each other. Your second question is an interesting one, thinking about the peripheral and the center. In some ways, I don't see these two things as necessarily being different from each other. I think that the kinds of questions I've been trying to ask in my research, in this research in particular, does center those kinds of deaf experiences and questions, right? And then in centering in that way, kind of flips out into the broader society or kind of the broader question, right? And so, I mean, I do see thinking about how the peripheral can teach us about the center is very much a parallel project to thinking about what centering the experiences of such people might be like. Yeah, I hope that made sense.
Thank you, Timothy. We have two more questions. I will read the first one, and then I will ask Ying to unmute herself to ask the second one before turning it back to you. The first one is from Zara. How can individuals like ourselves advocate to make SGSL an official language and raise deaf awareness? For example, encouraging clear masks around Singapore. And if I may invite Tan Ying to unmute, and hi Ying. Okay, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hi, Timothy. So great talk. Thank you very much. And well, it's like a half comment, half question, really. I totally agree with you that there really has been a neglect in terms of the way the deaf community has been represented in Singapore's language planning and policy. But like you also rightly pointed out, so is the case for many other languages here. And the whole metaphor of mother tongue has been problematic, and it has been problematic for the longest time. The state uses that. And again, the reason for why the state uses that is also because of this whole attachment to how the mother tongue languages are supposed to be the languages that impart values and the correct Asian values, whatever that means. So the usage of the term in itself is highly problematic to begin with. And I get the sense that from the title of the talk as well, and I think I'm echoing B's point too, is that it's almost, I don't know if I'm right in saying that it's almost, you're trying to reclaim that for SGSL. And I wonder if it's actually necessary to make that reclamation, because in the way we can conceptualize mother tongue, I totally believe in the agency back to the speakers and also to the communities of speakers, that it really doesn't have to depend on state assignment, and it also doesn't have to be determined by what people think it should be, but rather as a personal choice, and it's also a kind of linguistic practice, in which case then one does not need to be an orphan, right? That you can just do whatever you want, and at some point there will be a way in which we can all come together and say, I don't really care what you say, this is mine and this is it, you own it. So what do you think about that, Timothy?
Thank you for both for these questions. Zara, my question, I mean, my response to you is maybe a bit more straightforward, but I mean, I think more than anything, it's kind of working with the deaf community in Singapore. I would not call myself a policy maker by any stretch of imagination. Really, I'm an anthropologist. I'm very interested in social structures, social conditions, and how things come to be the way they are, right? But in terms of my own work, my own academic work, and my own approach to such questions, it is very much like, how do we work with deaf Singaporeans to help, to partner or to follow behind deaf people in kind of in their push to make SGSL an official language, or to give SGSL more visibility, or to give SGSL more legitimacy in multiple senses of the word. But thank you for the question. I think it is indeed a very important one, thinking about what the implications of such research might be. Professor Tan Ying, thank you so much. I, as you probably can tell, I am a big fan of your work, and I've learned so much from it. And yes, I think you're absolutely right in that in some ways there are multiple orphans in Singapore, right? So it's not just deaf people for sure. Though I do think that because of how things have progressed since the 1970s, 80s, the heyday, I guess, of language campaigns, that maybe it is less likely that the current generation, or like the younger generation of deaf Singapore, the current generation of Singaporeans now uses any of the dialects as really their mother tongues, right? But I mean, I think that's worth thinking about for sure. In terms of whether or not I think of mother tongue orphan as a reclaiming of the term, I think it was more in some ways to expose the fallacies of the metaphor, right? And so the reason why I chose to call this mother tongue orphan was because as you correctly mentioned, really in the literature on bilingualism, language policy, etc. in Singapore, mother tongue has been shown to be this really flawed term that is really problematic for various reasons, right? And then so in some ways, the goal of this metaphor is more to contest or to demonstrate that what the by calling certain things mother tongues, what gets left out, right? In some ways, and I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily invested in maintaining, preserving mother tongue, right? Though I do think that in response to your comments, that I think you're right in that that people's sense of ownership over language, or people's sense of belonging through language, doesn't necessarily have to take place through official recognition. But I think that the official recognition does provide some benefits to the people who are using those languages, right? Perhaps not the notion of making them no longer orphans, right? So I mean, I think that the metaphor can only go so far in some ways, right? But I think that again, the reason why I think a lot of deaf Singaporeans that I talk to at least want to see sign language, Singapore Sign Language recognized as official language, is to give that legitimacy to the language, right? So, and this is true not only in Singapore, but kind of broadly across the world, right? So like, for example, there was a lot of excitement on social media when, there was this Scandinavian country that had, sign language being used in parliament. So people were very excited for that level of visibility, right? And then so, I think that the deaf Singaporeans I spoke to felt the same way, right? For them, whether or not they have a sense of belonging to or not does not depend necessarily on state recognition, but state recognition does accrue such benefits.
Thank you. Thanks. B, I think you had your hand up. This will be the last question, and then maybe Tim can have the last word. You're muted, B.
Sorry, should I let someone else ask the question?
No, I think you're good. I think it's perfect.
First of all, I think Timothy, you're far too modest about your own linguistics experience. I just have two comments. One is about the mother tongue. Is that you brought a perspective of mother tongue from an anthropological point of view, which I found really interesting. That whole idea about transmission, generational transmission. Now, even if we take the pure linguistics mother tongue, not the Singaporean bastardization of the concept, the linguistic concept, which is the language that you first use at home, your L1. Even if we took that particular linguistics conceptualization of mother tongue, it is also problematic because, as I said, it's a very monolingual concept because it came from monolingual practices that people only have one language spoken at home. Remember, for a long, long time, the only people who publish, who get their papers published are monolinguals, right? Bilinguals, in a way, either internalized all these monolingual ideologies, or they came lately on the scene, maybe in the last 50 years. So for more than 50% of the world is actually bilingual. So there are many, many people who actually grew up with more than two languages at home. So that's one comment about mother tongue and how we might want to conceptualize it. And the other point I want to make is in answer to Zara's question about what can individuals do. Now, at this point, I just want to shout out to our interpreters today, Azam and Clara. As undergraduate students, they actually spearheaded they set up actually a sign language bank with the first 100 commonly used Singapore Sign Language words using the Swadesh list. Those of you who know something about languages know what the Swadesh list is. And since then, that particular project has grown. And I know that right now, perhaps I will send the link or Azam, if you have access, can you send the link to the Singapore Sign Language Bank? It now has 300 words. And I think one comment I want to make, the team actually spoke to, is this whole issue of insecurity. Now, the one reason why this project has not moved faster is because of all the contentions about really what is the right sign, you know. And like all speakers of any languages, there is a lot of insecurity about, are we, you know, showing the right sign? Is this the right one? And I think that has sort of slowed the project down. But otherwise, I think there are concerted efforts that has been made within the deaf community, and also by people who are interested in working with the deaf community, like people like Azam and Clara, in trying to create more, trying to give Singapore Sign Language more visibility. And I think this is a start. Even this talk today, thank you to team, is a start in trying to put the spotlight on the periphery.
Thank you very much, Bea, for that intervention. I think that's a really nice way to round things up this session. We like to give our speakers just 1 minute just to wrap up, because we really are out of time. Maybe 1 minute, one last thing you would like to say, Timothy, before we wrap.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, just thank you so much for the rich discussion and the questions. I think that, you know, as Professor rightly pointed out, that there are issues with the term mother tongue in multiple contexts, right? Again, I'm not personally very invested in preserving any of these, right? I think that actually one thing that's been interesting is that a lot of analysis of deaf communities has now used the concept of translanguaging, which is basically kind of adopting using multiple kinds of linguistic repertoires, whatever they might look like. Yes, and agreed that I think the Sign Language Bank is a very valuable project. And I will also say that a lot of the interlocutors that I spoke to also said that we need more linguistic kind of analysis and support for sign language, Singapore Sign Language, so that we know that it is legit, you know? So I think that that's really important. And I thank you all for these questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much, Timothy, Prof. Ng, and everyone else who's asked questions today. I personally really learned a lot in this session, so a round of applause for Timothy and Prof. Ng. Thank you everyone on the team who's been assisting today with access support. Thanks very much. We also appreciate everyone who's joined us today. The full video of this webinar, together with videos of earlier webinars, will be on our website. If you haven't already, please follow Academia SG on Facebook or Instagram, or sign up for our newsletter. We have another upcoming seminar on 30th of April. It's by So Wee Yang, and titled, "It is Dangerous to Talk Like Americans, the Rise of a Singaporean Exceptionalism, Inadvertently Modeled on American Right Traditions." We have very exciting lineups of junior scholars who are doing really interesting work on it, really across disciplines and on a wide range of issues on Singapore studies. And audience participation and attendance at these things is extremely important for doing what for sort of getting us going, you know, and helping to sustain this effort to build Singapore studies. So please join us again. And again, thank you to our presenters today. See you next time. Have a good evening.